Hello and welcome to another Special Needs Jungling Conversation. I'm Tania Tirraoro. Today we're delving into the world of teaching assistants, the pros, the cons, the do's, the don'ts, and what it's reasonable to expect from a TA. To do this, I'm joined by two experts in the subject. Rob Webster, an Associate Professor at the Centre for Inclusive Education at UCL Institute of Education. Rob leads the Maximising the Impact of Teaching Assistants initiative. He delivers training for school leaders in TAs. Welcome, Rob.
Hello there.
Hi, and we're also joined by longtime SNJ columnist Bren Prendergast, who is a specialist teacher, parent trainer with SEN help and a seasoned advocate. Welcome, Bren.
Good morning or good afternoon.
Good afternoon, yeah. So it's lovely to have you both with us today to talk about the use of teaching assistants. Now, TA hours make up the mainstay of many EHCPs and also provide the bulk of support for children on SEN support. However, the SEN Code of Practice does point out that they should never be used as a substitute for quality first teaching. But Brent, it's clear that many TAs are mums who want to earn a bit of money, and it is only a bit of money while their kids are in school. What minimum basic training do you think a TA should be given before beginning to support children with SEN?
Well, actually, I mean, that's quite a large sweeping question, which is possibly not that straightforward to answer, straight off. I mean, there are a great many parents out there who may make an absolutely excellent TA, perhaps that they are fluent in sign language. So if they were to be supporting a child in school who also is learning to sign, then they're already got a flying start and some of the skills that would be required. But that TA would not be of any use, for example, for a child who's got fetal alcohol syndrome, who may not be signing and may have completely different sets of needs. So the important thing is to look at the individual child's needs, then look at the skill set of the parent, and then decide what training needs are required. And I think that that's a two-pronged approach, that we need to look for the child from the holistic point of view, but we also need to be looking for assisting teaching and learning. And I think that's where, Rob comes in with a lot of his training, is the need for a proper understanding of how teaching and learning actually takes place. So first off, primarily, you would need to be looking at the individual child's needs and training that TA on that individual child's needs, not the generic header of they have this diagnosis, unless that diagnosis is specific, like type 1 diabetes, in which case they'll need to be trained in that respect. And then, as I say, to be trained to understand teaching and learning. And that's where you would start going through the NVQ and the maximising TAs route.
Rob, now you say that you accept the evidence that teachers have a very limited impact on children and young people, but you say it's crucial to get that into context. So can you put that into context for us, please?
Well, when we talk about the impact of teaching assistants, I think we'd accept that it's many and varied, and some of those things are easier to measure than others. So the things that we tend to zero in on are the academic outcomes, learning outcomes, improvements in reading, and so on. I completely accept that there are other ways in which TAs have an impact. We may well talk about those, but just to focus just on learning outcomes. So a large-scale piece of research that we did at the Institute of Education some years ago now found that the amount of support that children received from teaching assistants had in fact a negative relationship, a negative impact on their learning outcomes in English and maths and science. And we found that quite consistently across year groups in primary school and secondary school, and it was quite a profound effect as well. It wasn't just sort of minor. In some cases, it was the equivalent of several months learning lost, and it's very easy, and indeed some newspapers and some areas of the media that picked up immediately on the idea that somehow must mean that TAs are doing a bad job, that there must be kind of, in inverted commas, to blame for this. But we were really clear from the data that we had, that we collected alongside the impact data in this project, that actually, if you're kind of looking to blame TAs, you're essentially looking in the wrong place, because the effects are not to do with teaching assistants. It's not that they are doing a bad job at all. You can kind of strike that out. It's entirely about how TAs are, to put it quite succinct, it is decisions made about TAs, not by TAs, that the problem here. So it's the ways in which they are trained or not trained when they start the job. And the first question to Bren was kind of picking that up. The minimum basic training, well, by and large, TAs get very little. In fact, it probably nothing. And equally, teachers don't really get much either to know how to work with TAs. Also, we know that teachers don't get much training to know how to work with kids with special needs, but the TAs are in the room, so it falls into this pattern of just letting the TA work with these children. And we've also got sort of quite hard and compelling data as well that suggests that part of the problem is because the children, particularly children with statements and EHCPs, because they spend so much time with teaching assistants, because that's the way we've kind of set things up, that comes at a cost of time with the teacher. So there are several planks to the explanation, but I think the really kind of key thing when we're kind of talking about the what appears to be a limited impact of TAs is that it's not attributable to them. In a sense, it's about schools not making the most of that capacity that they have.
So actually the problem is within teacher training, to start off with, as to how to use the TA, and maybe establishing some national recognised qualifications for TAs. I know there are some, but to make it a desirable profession.
There's two things going on there. There's one is, what are we going to do for the TAs themselves? And absolutely, I think it's high time we, nationally, had an agreement or an idea about what it is we want TAs to go into the profession with, minimally, and if they don't have it, how we're going to provide for it, and to make sure that they are not they're not failed. Otherwise we're kind of setting them up to fail, to go into a classroom with the kids who find learning and engagement the trickiest and expecting them to work miracles. And one of the reasons why we do that is related to your other point, is that we don't do it for teachers. We consistently find that teachers rate their confidence and their competence around working with and teaching children with special needs, and their ability to deploy teaching assistants. Those are two things that they rank the lowest in their areas of confidence, and you kind of consistently find that over the years. So that tells you something nationally. In initial teacher training, we are not giving teachers those kinds of skills, and as long as we keep doing that, we'll keep on sort of, I think, doing what we've done for years, and that is deploy the teaching assistants to work with the children who find accessing learning trickiest.
So picking up on that in a way, Brent, the TA is often the person given the responsibility to carry out, for example, a speech and language program, but they're not speech and language therapists, and often they don't have any training to that effect, and neither do teachers. I mean, how fair is this for the child or for the TA, do you think, Bren?
Well, it's quite an interesting question, because where you've got a child with an intervention, for instance, such as speech and language, or it could be physiotherapy, occupational therapy, art therapy, all of these people have got to be registered with the Healthcare Professions Council, and they have a set of standards. And standard number 4 is specifically about delegation, and you must delegate appropriately. You must delegate to somebody else who has the knowledge and experience needed to carry out safely and effectively that program. Sorry, paraphrasing slightly. And they must continue to provide that supervision. So in that sense, that whilst the class teacher has overall responsibility for every child in their class and their learning, that the therapists themselves have also got a responsibility to make sure that that TA is actually appropriate to carry out that work. It is not appropriate for any professional to be writing a program, leaving an untrained TA just to deliver it and then not to monitor it. It's simply not appropriate. It's against the professional standards.
That's what happens.
We know, and I've seen it frequently on EHC plans as well. But I mean, that's one of the points about this conversation, that we can have this conversation and now parents can be going along and saying, oh, hang on a minute, what did she say? Oh, yes, it was the Healthcare Professionals Council, standard number 4. And then they can perhaps go back to the therapist and say, well, are you meeting this standard really? Because I'm not confident. Can you explain that to me? And then maybe we'll start seeing a little bit more change going on. But nobody registered with the Healthcare Professions Council should be delegating their work to somebody who is not competent to carry it out. And it is not fair on the TA to be expecting them to do so.
And I don't expect many parents would have the confidence or the knowledge to be able to go up to the school and say, actually, what you've just said about, Article 4 or whatever, they just have no clue what's going on in school.
And the teacher may not actually know that either.
So the child in the end is the one who loses out because of the lack of training all the way around and the lack of accountability.
Yes, I mean, as I say, the accountability there comes with the class teacher. But like Rob has just said, that often the class teacher isn't trained how to work with the TA. And they may not have this knowledge themselves to step in.
But Rob, you say TAs are the mortar in the brickwork when it comes to including children and young people with SEN in mainstream schools. So what would you say makes an effective TA?
On that point of the mortar in the brickwork, I mean, I've sort of arrived at that a few years ago, and it's partly informed by this sort of conundrum I mentioned a while ago about impact. And I mean, I think one of the sort of quickest ways of trying to convey this is it's sometimes a sort of thought experiment I do with Senkos or school leaders, and I'll say to them, imagine sort of going into school after half term or after a weekend or something, and your TAs aren't going to be there. In fact, they're not. It's not just for Monday. They're going to be. That's it. They're not turning up again. That's it. And I just asked them to just sort of spend a couple of minutes just thinking through the implications of not having teaching assistants in their schools. What isn't going to get done that just routinely gets done all day, every day? And that really, I think, cuts to the heart of the impact issue.
So, Bren, given all that, how can we change the mindset of local authorities who insist on not specifying the wording in EHCPs? So TAs do end up being shared if parents aren't informed, because quite often it says one-to-one, and parents find out that in fact it isn't one-to-one, and is in fact one-to-one a good idea?
Yes, I mean the the specificity should always be there within a plan, and it should be very clear, you know, when the child is having support and by whom. There is old case law on this, LV Clark and Somerset, and it's been that was from old statements, and it's also been revisited in a number of other since cases that says that it would be difficult to see how provision, specificity and quantification of provision can be made without setting out staffing hours, teaching assistant hours. Unfortunately, about changing the mindset is that we know, and I think Rob has alluded to, that his research got pounced on as TAs are bad, so we'll cut them out, which is definitely not the case at all. The only thing is with anything is it sadly comes down to parents acting as policemen of the system, and
which
cascading.
They shouldn't have to.
No, and cascading that knowledge. And where necessary, taking action through tribunal mediation, obviously first, if possible, but tribunal. But we need to be specific about what it is that the TA is to provide. What we don't want is a babysitter, and a lot of children don't actually need a one-to-one TA for every hour of the time that they're in school. But then there's no point on an EHC plan to say 15 hours a week if you're not actually writing out where those 15 hours are to be had. I mean, if you've got a child with, say, reasonably significant cerebral palsy, there'd be no point saying, well, we're only going to be providing for this lesson and not that, unless that child is perfectly capable of undertaking certain lessons without that support. But another child might actually only need a bit of checking in, checking out. So we do need to be very, very careful on the wording and what it actually means. Sharing TAs can be absolutely excellent. For many children, it says that they need to have social communication groups. And of course, then that's, you know, an obvious point of where TAs would be shared, because the chances are the other children in that social communication group are also benefiting from the TA time and from that group. But we need to consider what happens if, where you're sharing a TA, what happens if your child needs that TA and that TA is out on a job for somebody else. Say another child's taken ill and the TA is dealing with that child and therefore no longer accessible. A school needs to know how many hours support and where that support should be in order to organise its staff. How does it know how many TAs will require employing, or in fact whether they want to spend all that money on TAs, whether they may actually prefer to spend it on having a speech and language therapist come in and work alongside some of the teachers, or an occupational therapist to come in and work alongside. So we do need some level of flexibility for schools and the way they use their budgets. And we don't want this dependency, and we don't want this position where the child is getting further and further removed from their teacher because there's that one-to-one support. But we do need to look at each individual child and actually clearly state where that support should be at. I mean, I liken it to reading a menu. If I go to the local Indian restaurant and I order a Rogan Josh, I want to know, you know, how spicy it is. I want to know what the ingredients are. You know, it's tomatoey, is it medium hot? I want to know these things. And an EHC plan or even a SEND support document should be exactly the same. We should know, actually, you know, it's 3 p.m. on a Friday, it's history. What support's my child going to get in history? And that may depend on their particular type of SEN. So again, it's making sure that that plan's specified and quantified. And we can, I will give a shout out to obviously the charities IPSI, SOS, SEN, and my own with SEN Help, who are there to actually help you with knowing where's right, what's wrong. IPSI do a wonderful checklist. And the SEN Code of Practice 9.69 has taken that wording from LV Clark and Somerset and actually said that support hours should generally be set out. So it is a case of checking the wording carefully.
Rob, some people find that some parents say, that one-to-one is really important to them and their child, and but others, as Bren's alluded to, say that it encourages dependence. In fact, the independent specialist school that my children went to didn't have any one-to-ones. They just had small classes with individual timetables, and the children came out there with actually quite stellar results. So how can you find that happy medium so that a child is as supported as they need to be while still promoting the development of independent learning?
It's entirely understandable why, in a system like ours, why you would want one-to-one support from an additional adult for your child in a mainstream setting. Particularly if it's a secondary setting, lots and lots of children, really kind of busy. We kind of probably don't need to enumerate for SNJ readers and listeners what those reasons are. But it's worth just thinking about why do parents find themselves having to ask for this in the first place? And I just wonder whether it's because of some of these long-standing issues that we haven't skilled up teachers enough to be confident to work with kids with SEN, because really we don't offer much else. The only kind of thing that seems to be on the table is hours, and those are very quickly converted into teaching assistant hours. And I suppose what I sort of try to do in the work that I'm involved is just try to sort of find a little bit of gaps in there and get sort of people to maybe think differently. I know that's very difficult because our system is so so kind of embedded in terms of what we're doing, but I still think we need to kind of find time to just sort of question some of the some of the long-standing practices. For us, it's we talk about teaching assistants giving children the least amount of help first. So in a sense, I think it's how the time is used when the TA is with the child. So you can, in a sense, make better use of it. So what we've seen in some of the research that we've done is that teaching assistants will tend to focus on getting the task completed and the task completed correctly. Now, it's important to say that one of the reasons that happens is just if it hasn't been sufficiently sort of framed up by the head teacher, for example, about what the teaching assistant should and shouldn't be doing in the school, then TAs tend to kind of drift towards doing those kinds of practices. So it's important to say that's not in any way a criticism on the TAs. I think one of the most important things that TAs can do in this sort of independence-dependent space is to just let the child sit with the work and the problem for a while. One thing that sort of seems to characterise TAs' interactions is that they will they won't leave enough thinking time for the child, so they'll be quite quickly asking them, well, what do you think about this and that? And it's quite uncomfortable. TAs tell us when we do the training and they've been using these skills for a while, that actually one of the hardest things is to just live with a bit of uncomfortable silence for 5 or 6 seconds while the child tries to work things out. So it's a really kind of simple strategy, but it's quite effective because it is giving the space for the child to be independent. And another kind of phrase we use is this comfortable struggle. So nobody, and we're not advocating that TAs just sit back and let kids really, really struggle, but they do need to sort of struggle just a little bit in order to have a go at the task. And it's just recognising when that struggle has got a bit too much and an intervention is needed. And so sort of saying the right thing in the right way at the right time.
Just to reinforce what Rob said, is that you're not allowing the child to just fall down a hole. It's that little bit of extra support So you're working within what can the child do now? What is the child capable of doing with how much support? And judging that support that you give correctly. So you're not expecting the step for the child to actually leap across that hole, but you're giving them the little steps that they can take to get to the end result themselves. So you're just giving them that little nudge, and the framework that Rob's been talking about is that, you know, you would be asking those thoughts of, well, you know, have you met this problem before? You know, do you know what you're doing? Those little nudges first to try and get the child actually working. But it is about, I mean, we all know ourselves. You don't naturally know how to wallpaper a room, but if somebody gives you a little nudge and gives you a little hint or whatever, you're probably going to be quite proficient at doing it yourself, if you've got that little right information. And that comes down to the teachers again, is making sure that the teachers know where that child is at and what level of differentiation is actually required for that TA to then deliver. Because, as I say, if the gap is too large, the child's going to give up. But if the gap's small enough, the child will keep nudging forward little by little. And at the end of the day, the teaching assistant is there not as a surrogate parent, and they're not there as the teacher, but they're there to assist in those little steps of learning, whatever those steps of learning, and at whatever speed that child goes at. But if the TA isn't properly primed, because the teacher hasn't done that priming job, because they don't know how to do that priming job, and it's like what Rob said, we need to reimagine this whole scenario, and we need to change the whole scenario.
Part of that scenario is working with parents. So
yes, most definitely.
What would you say is the best communication practice when it comes to the SENCO, the teacher, the TA, and the parent?
I think frequently what is not happening is that there is no time timetabled into the diary for these things to happen. We know that parents can obviously have a meeting with the teacher 3 times a year. That's set as standard. But for the teacher, the TA, for everybody to get around a table together is frequently just once a year at the annual review. And that's not acceptable. The teacher and the TA do need to have time put to one side, whether it's daily or weekly, to talk to each other. And there needs to be the bringing in of parents, as you say. Some parents want to hand everything over. They might want daily updates. They might want weekly updates. They might think, actually, if it's all going well, I don't need updating. And that really depends on the individual, and that's a conversation to have with the teacher and the parent. But I mean, TAs often start work after the child arrives because they've dropped their child off at school, and they often leave early because they're collecting their child, and there is no time. And I think that maybe that's something that is part of that reimagining, where you actually get people together in a proper timetabled way. But even worst case scenario, round robin emails. I mean, most people are online these days, WhatsApp, you know, there's lots of ways. I heard it over and over again, can't possibly have you come into a meeting by video. And here we have with COVID and the change around of all of those people, and it is with a wry smile that I'm thinking, why was it you were telling me over and over again at these meetings that it wasn't actually physically possible to Skype people in or whatever, and now all of a sudden we're here? So yes, I mean, this is maybe a good way, a Teams meeting if necessary. But you do have to make sure that you know your parent, because if your parent's got some difficulties, maybe they don't have a smartphone, maybe they don't have an internet, maybe they don't have literacy, that you don't want to embarrass the parent. And there are a lot of parents who don't engage because they're too embarrassed to, because they don't that there's something, there's a blockage, and you do need to know your parent where that blockage is, and try and enable them to join those conversations, because at the end of the day, the expert in the child is the parent.
One of the things actually I really wanted to find is because often children are taken out of classrooms to be taught. Should that ever happen, or should it always happen within the classroom?
Well, I suppose the kind of the researcher's answer is it depends. And I mean, I would say that the principle should be, if the child is being withdrawn from the classroom, you really ought to have a very good reason. It should at least compensate for the fact that they're being taken out of the classroom and away from their teacher and away from their peers. Now, there could be some very good reasons for doing that. It's not a sort of a complete no-no. It might be that actually the child has some sensory needs, for example, and then being out in a different space to do some work is really important, because otherwise they just wouldn't produce very good work. What I think teachers particularly have to be mindful of is just the routine way in which that happens. So sometimes, I guess a thing to guard against is the TA taking out a group of children after the teacher's done their class input, just so that they can do the same work outside the classroom that they could be doing inside the classroom. And when you separate them like that, they're kind of away from the teacher. The teacher's away from them. So you're causing and that's not an entirely necessary separation. So I think you just have to be very careful about the conditions under which you do it. It tends to get done. It tends to happen most, because children are having a particular intervention, and that could be something to do with maybe physio, or it could be some speech and language input. And it may well be far more appropriate to do that outside the classroom than inside. And we didn't talk about this earlier on, but there's really, really good evidence when teaching assistants deliver intervention catch-up programs with children, that children can make quite accelerated progress. It's one sort of under-discussed, unheralded. If you're looking for, we want to talk about the impact that TAs can have in terms of learning, you just kind of look at the evidence on this. It's remarkable, and it's remarkably consistent as well. But it's just making sure that if you're doing that as a school, then that's kind of properly integrated. So things that you would want to avoid, for example, is if your child really likes PE and excels at PE, it's a great chance for them to feel successful at PE. Don't bring them out of PE to give them extra maths. It's kind of it's some thoughtful timetabling, if you like, around that.
And because often if they're out of the classroom, what it ends up is that the TA can end up teaching, which, Bren, something that you say should never ever happen. So, and indeed I wouldn't want my child at the time to be taught by someone who wasn't qualified, but it does happen, particularly if there are staff shortages, or in COVID, if classes are split into two. But what option does the school have if that's the case?
Well,
Go on, Bren, go on.
Well, the thing is that there are supply agencies. I used to do supply teaching. I mean, I would be querying what's going on in a school if it's relying on TAs to deliver classes routinely. I mean, there may be an emergency. The school may have been told at 8 o'clock in the morning that a teacher's not coming in. The supply agency may then have to go and phone around various places. So you may have a TA that steps in for that short period of time. Or, if a teacher was suddenly taken ill, yes, and I have to say that actually, when I did my teacher training, I did it in post-16, and I did it as a mature student. And some of the best advice and teaching was from my TAs, rather than what I was being given from what was supposed to be my mentors within college. And when I've gone in to do supply teaching as well through schools, is that where they have had TAs in the class, they've been able to tell me the routine of the class really well. They've been able to say, you know, what some of the children's needs are straight up. And they've done an excellent job at guiding me and helping me do my job. But I am a qualified teacher, and I know how children learn, and part of my master's is also in child development. And Rob on his course teaches some of that teacher training to TAs so they can understand that of the way in which children learn. But as I say, a TA is not a teacher. They're not trained to teach. They shouldn't be teaching as a general rule. But I do also have to bring up the fact that it is only local authority maintained schools that actually require a qualified teacher. Academies, independent schools can employ whomever they wish. But certainly, I mean, on a pay grade of a TA, no. You know, from that aspect, I think that if a school is paying a TA to teach, they should be paying teaching wages and training.
So I think to kind of round up, but the issues that I'm hearing is that it's a teacher training issue of learning how to work with a TA, and maybe there needs to be some more structural training for TAs that they can have as a professional qualification. So what needs to happen now? Either of you, go for it.
You first, Bren.
I thought I'll wait for Rob to step in then. I mean, certainly there's been discussion about teaching assistant standards. And I think that the profession does need to be more highly valued. There needs to be a much more higher standing and qualifications going on. I think it is part of that bigger picture. But I will also bring in something that we haven't mentioned when we're talking about the children's scaffolding, is that there is an awful lot of assistive technology out there. And that assistive technology can be extremely useful for having children working on their own without the requirements of a TA, or with only a little bit of support from a TA. And I think that is certainly underused. I mean, you know, if you've got a child with very poor literacy, very delayed literacy skills, then, you know, by the time you get to year 5, you should be teaching using the exam pens, the reading pens, you know, dictation software and things like that, so that the child can start actually being able to record their own work independently and confidently, and, you know, with typing skills before they actually get into high school. And then, as I say, we would perhaps see far fewer breakdowns of placements when we get to high school, if there was much better TA and teacher training in the younger years to prepare those children. But also we do need the higher years, because secondary teachers don't tend to have that same child development background that the primary teachers would have.
I mean, I'd echo some of what Bren said there about a general sort of valuing and esteeming of the role. I mean, we have, I say we, and I mean, as a sort of education system, this is the path we've chosen. Yeah, this is kind of what has, well, I say chosen. I don't know how much, how deliberate it was, but we are where we are. We've ended up in a system where we have about just over a quarter of the people working in our schools have the role of a teaching assistant, and you won't find an education system in the world with a proportion of their school workforce doing that role. But we, again, as a system, and I suppose I sort of point the finger a bit higher up towards sort of government level here, there has never really been a firm view about what TAs are there for and what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. And you will, I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think you'll find a speech by an education minister in the last 15 years where they get much of a mention at all. Certainly not a speech about teaching assistants. They might get a kind of a nod and a thank you, but that's really it. And it just strikes me as being an oversight, if you like. This is a huge number of people in the system, and as I said earlier, it's undeniable that they're having some kind of impact, even if that is a little bit hard to pin down. They are having some kind of an impact, and you'll struggle to find a school, particularly with what we've been going through with COVID, that would struggle to stay open if they didn't have them. And I think I would like to say as a start, if you like, is just some kind of national recognition. And I don't mean we should all go out on our front doorsteps on a Thursday night and clap them. I mean something, and we should do that definitely. But I think something a little bit more serious, like some proper, well thought through standards, some training requirements, something that very clearly communicates the value and some kind of investment and recognition for what they're doing.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much for such an interesting discussion. We've had a bit of a battle with some sound issues, but we got there in the end. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to Bren Prendergast and to Rob Webster for joining me. And I hope you will also join us again for our next episode of Special Needs Jungle in Conversation. Bye-bye for now.